The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, why what municipalities buy and build are poised to become part of the tariff battle with the U.S. Then, what the uncertainty around tariffs means for the Canadian economy. That's all next on The Agenda. Donald Trump has not yet imposed widespread tariffs on Canada, but already municipal leaders are waving the maple leaf and promising to investigate made-in-Canada substitutes for goods and services sourced from the U.S. But with deeply integrated cross-border supply chains, the job of procurement professionals just got harder. So how practical is it for Ontario cities and towns to replace U.S. goods? For a closer look at the opportunities to support Canadian businesses and the risks of restricting U.S. suppliers, let's welcome, in Barry's Bay, Ontario, Paul Emanuele, Managing Director of the Procurement Office, which has offered purchasing advice to hundreds of public institutions across North America. In London, Ontario, Josh Morgan, the Mayor of the Forest City. And here in studio, Jennifer Moore, Chief Administrative Officer of Northumberland County, which covers 7 municipalities in Eastern Ontario. And Jennifer, it's nice to have you on the program for the first time. Paul, I think you're a first-timer as well. And Your Worship, it's good to have you back on our airwaves here on TVO. And why don't I start with you, Your Worship. What's the main reason for reassessing procurement right now?
I'd say there's 2 reasons. One is to have a really good understanding about where we're procuring from, how well we're procuring both locally and from Canadian sources, but as well as to prepare for any sort of changes to the rules that might happen, whether that's changes to interprovincial trade barriers, changes to the provincial rules that oversee how municipalities do procurement, or even the renegotiation of international trade agreements. For us to have a really good understanding about how we procure, where the restrictions are for procuring local, will allow us to feed that back up through the chain to our federal counterparts in preparation for any sort of significant renegotiation of any trade agreements.
And let me do a quick follow-up with you. Have you directed your staff or your council or the people you have to deal with on a daily basis to take that extra step to buy Canadian, to procure Canadian, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so all we've done so far is ask our staff to do an analysis of our procurement policy with the idea that we would like to ensure that we can shift towards buying Canadian and local where we can. It's already expected that we're doing a lot of that already, but I've also engaged with the other major procurers in our city, educational institutions, hospitals, the school boards, to ask them to take a review and a look at their policies, which they've agreed to as well. At this point, again, we tend to procure a lot locally, but I think we just need a greater understanding about exactly what we're doing, and that's why we've ordered and directed the review, and that review is happening and should be reported back soon.
Gotcha. Jennifer, how about you in Northumberland County? Are you reassessing?
Absolutely. We've started to look at where we purchase. We actually purchase most of our products from Ontario, Canada, or local. About 1% of our supplier database is directly from the U.S. So it's a fairly small portion, but we're looking at some of our major projects and assessing those. Capital is where we have our biggest concerns, and looking at some of the inputs that'll go into those projects and whether or not the affordability will still be there for some of our projects. So balancing that and looking at what the cost impacts might be if we see some of the tariffs.
And a follow-up for you. I think you need to give, or let's give our listeners and viewers a sense about what Northumberland County purchases. So when you're reassessing procurement, what are we talking about?
We buy a very wide range. So everybody thinks about our capital projects. We're paving roads, we're buying asphalt, we're buying steel for bridges, we're looking at housing developments, but we also buy food for our long-term care home. We buy supplies, healthcare supplies for our paramedic department. We buy office supplies. We purchase a huge range of goods and services, and they vary greatly. Some of them are quite unique. Some of them are standard that you might buy in your house, and it's a pretty broad range, and they come from our supplies come from all over.
Any guess at a dollar figure?
Our budget for this year is about $230 million.
That's real money.
So it is. About 58 million is our capital over the next couple of years. And that's really where we're focusing our biggest look at risk for tariffs.
Gotcha. Paul, how difficult is it for procurement officers now across this province who, for understandable reasons, are being asked to rethink how they do their thing?
Well, I'll give you just one example from this morning, Steve. I was looking at the retaliatory tariff schedule that the federal government just released this morning. It's a 170-page document. It has over 2,000 categories with multiple subcategories within it of products that now are facing a 25% tariff, that we're feeling immediate pressure in every contract that's being managed across the Canadian public sector to deal with this price volatility. So these are real and present disruptions to government activities that we're feeling in real time.
You give advice to customers not only in Canada, but I presume clients in the States as well?
We work exclusively for the purchaser side, predominantly almost exclusively for government bodies. We don't advise suppliers, and our practice is from coast to coast across Canada, and we do some international work for public institutions more globally as well. That's right.
What do you tell people to do right now?
On the procurement front, as far as retaliatory bans to U.S. products, we're recommending that everyone hold the line and not escalate this trade war. We need to de-escalate it because of the unintended consequences and complexities that will be created by imposing Made in Canada requirements in our projects, in our tendering processes. Further, we're recommending brace for impact because of the price volatility we're currently feeling because of the retaliatory tariffs being imposed by our federal government on day-to-day contracts that we're currently acquiring under.
Your Worship, what does brace for impact look like in London?
Well, it means a number of things, but first and foremost, it means understanding the complexity of the supply chain. I'll give you an example of something that through conversations I've had with our procurers, the companies that we procure with, something that's come up. We build a lot of roads, sewers, reconstruction of basic municipal infrastructure. I spoke with one of the contractors who does major sewer projects for us. They said one of the main impacts they would have is the pipes that they put in the ground are made in Canada, but the resin made to produce those pipes is pretty much only made in the U.S. And so, we can say, well, let's not buy the pipes, but the pipes are technically generating Canadian jobs and economic activity here. But there's a component of those pipes that could, if tariffed, actually increase the cost for everybody. So we're trying to do a deep level dive into, the second level of how this could be impacted, because one of the things we want to do is provide feedback to the federal government on what to counter tariff and what not to counter tariff. As was just mentioned, there's a long and complex list. We need to be able to be in a position to give feedback to say, we don't have anywhere else to go for this product. If you tariff it, all you do is raise costs on Canadians, and we probably buy it anyways. So if we can be as strategic as possible with any sort of counter tariffs that are considered, so that we're only really counter tariffing things that are our true Canadian or international alternatives for, that would be preferable. But that requires a deep level of analysis to even get it close to being able to provide that feedback.
Mm-hmm. And what's your budget in the City of London every year?
Our budget is about $1.3 billion, including the boards and commissions, and our capital plan just for the municipality is about $200 million.
And given how you just described the complexity of trying to figure out what's a Canadian product and what's an American product and what's both, do you have a sense about what percentage of your budget is Canadian versus purchased down south?
We have an initial assessment of our general procurement, the things we buy. It's over 60% local and regional. It's probably up in the mid to upper 90s Canadian or Ontario Canadian generally. But there are portions of our budget that would be US based, but that's only a high level analysis. Like I just discussed, when you get into the second component or second level of that, there may be inputs into those projects that we procure from Canadian businesses with Canadian jobs that actually have American inputs into them. So that's how complicated this can get. And that's why I think, as was mentioned, a really slow, steady, thoughtful analysis about what to do and what not to do is here. Because, technically, there's an American company, but that has a plant here in my city, and it's employing Londoners doing a job and producing products that are produced here. That's doing something to that company is only going to hurt those local jobs. So it's not just about what we procure. It's about who's making them, who's employed, and what jobs we're protecting as well.
Paul, boy, is that a good example of how this gets complicated, eh?
Very, very good example. I'll give you another one, Steve. I was just doing some back of the envelope math today, looking at one of the categories in the federal not the ban list, the tariff list, rubber tires, all sorts of rubber tires. And I did some quick math. The extra cost of a tire change in all the school buses in Ontario would run the taxpayer over $20 million, just the tire change because of the extra levy. So that's real money being drawn out of the municipal tax base that goes to school bus transportation services. And that's just one of thousands of examples out there.
Well, let me pluck this off your website, Paul, because you published this yesterday, which speaks to the complexity of what we're discussing tonight. Sheldon, you want to bring this up, and I'll read along for those listening on podcast? Here's Paul Emanuele writing from the Procurement Office. How would we establish that a company is Canadian? Would a physical presence operating on Canadian soil be the test to qualify as Canadian? Would U.S.-owned companies with U.S. head offices that also operate Canadian offices and facilities and employ Canadians qualify as Canadian? Would it make a difference whether they were operating directly from the U.S. parent company or operated in Canada through a wholly U.S.-owned Canadian subsidiary? Okay, Paul, follow up on that. You've asked some great questions. Do we know the answers to those questions?
We don't. In one municipality that's rushed forward with a Canadian content set of rules, I was going through their rules and conducting an analysis and considering ambulance purchases. And if you look at a Canadian-owned company that manufactures ambulances but has the final assembly in the United States, they may not be Canadian enough in that test. They may be too American if more than 20% of their workforce is in the U.S. at the assembly plant. So the unfortunate unintended consequence, which is perfectly foreseeable of these kind of rules, was that the Canadian company would be disqualified. And I looked it up. They do manufacture ambulances in China. So the Chinese bidder could win that, and we'd end up buying ambulances from China while disqualifying the Canadian company because they were too American.
Oh, my goodness. Jennifer, in Northumberland County, does it get this complicated as you try to figure out what's Canadian and what isn't?
Absolutely. Everything that we look at, it has so many different components to it. And we even look at what we're doing with our own vendors and looking at our local economy and trying to encourage that buy local. But many of them, they might just simply retail. And we want to keep those jobs as well in our local community. So even for our small purchases, there can be a big multiplier effect if we were to stop buying anything with that American component. We see heavy equipment, and there's places where we need certain things. And Paul gave the example of an ambulance. And we're already backlogged. We've still never recovered on the delivery times after COVID. And we're trying to get some of those pieces of equipment that are critical to our services that we must deliver to our communities. They rely on those, in some cases life and death, and we can't disqualify something because it has a certain percentage of an American component, or we might not be able to deliver that service, and it could be quite critical if we don't buy those products.
Mayor Morgan, you're the one politician on our group today, so I want to ask you about another politician's recent speech. I suspect you saw Jean Chrétien speak at the Liberal leadership on Sunday, where he sort of jokingly suggested we should put up Donald Trump for the Order of Canada because he's done such a good job unifying Canadians, admittedly against him. But let me pluck a serious question out of that, which is, should we give Trump some credit for the fact that Canadian municipalities and businesses and people in general are now starting to think about an issue, namely Buy Canadian, in a way that we haven't before? What do you think?
Absolutely. I've actually said this a number of times in some speeches I've given in the city here. I think Donald Trump and the external threat he's created has been a very positive force on Canadian unity and the ability of not just governments, but governments, business, citizens to all kind of pull together in a common direction, setting aside political differences of opinion. I mean, look at the conversation happening about interprovincial trade barriers, just as an example. This is something that has been decades of different politicians trying to pick at, and it seems it has become a much simpler conversation simply because of an external threat that Donald Trump has created. So, we're going to get through this challenge over some period of time, one way or another, if we can harness the good that has come from the unity, because we were a country going down a very strong path of division, much like the United States. And this has been a very unifying factor. If we can keep that as a center for us moving forward. We have so much potential once we get through this crisis to really collaborate and build a country that I think is going to be much better than it was before this threat came in the first place. So that's my optimistic silver lining on all this challenge that we have before us.
How about it, Jennifer? Do you see the same silver lining?
Absolutely. I can see our community pulling together. I can see a lot of people looking at products that maybe we hadn't thought about manufacturing locally or offering locally, and looking at ways that our economic development teams can be part of this procurement and actually supporting our local businesses and saying, what have you not been building? What can we offer locally? How can they ramp up production and broaden their markets? It's a great opportunity for those businesses to really expand what they can deliver.
Having said all that, Paul, would it still be preferable if the president just simply stopped all this tariff nonsense and we could actually get back to a saner way to do business?
That would be an ideal outcome, Steve. I think that we need to de-escalate this issue, certainly not expand it on the procurement front, and see what Trump's threats are, which is largely a bluff that he keeps walking back, because his tariffs will cause more immediate damage to the U.S. economy than they will to the impact on Canadian suppliers. The Canadian impact will be severe, but the impact will be more immediate in the U.S., and that's why I think this is a bit of a tempest in the teapot. At least I hope that it is.
Let me do a follow-up with you on this, because you're a lawyer too, right, Paul?
That's right.
Okay, so could you give us an example of how, municipalities are now starting to think about how to change their procurement policies in order to deal with all this tariff business? Presumably somewhere, somehow down the road, that could also open them up to some legal jeopardy because of just all of the complications that we've been talking about today. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Let's go back to that example of the Canadian content requirement. What we can't forget is once you set those rules up, you can enforce them, and you have to enforce them once you set them up in your bidding process. So if you have an unintended consequence, you can't then decide, actually, we didn't mean that outcome. We actually do want to buy those Canadian ambulances. Too late once you set those rules in process, and every government contract will then be subject to legal challenge on whether we apply the Canadian content rules correctly, and those rules will be extremely complicated to apply and time-consuming to apply if they ever could be applied defensively.
So let me ask you, Mayor Morgan, are you worried about getting sued more because of the crazy world we live in now?
No, I'm not, because we're taking a cautious approach. That's why we haven't jumped to making changes right away, but done an analysis of our procurement policies and expect that back. And as I said in the intro, part of that analysis is to prepare ourselves for any sort of legal changes that may happen, whether those be provincial or renegotiations of international trade agreements. Because, Paul's absolutely right. There are rules in place, and if you change your rules, you got to follow them. But we cannot be offside, despite the fact that Donald Trump may not respect international agreements. We can't be offside with significant international agreements that require us to keep commitments that the federal government or provincial governments have already made. So, we need to move in lockstep with other levels of government, and we need to be prepared for rule changes, but we can't get ahead of them in a way that puts us at legal risk, because that's just going to cost us more money, and that's what we're trying to avoid in all this.
I hear what you're saying, but as a political leader, do you not also find yourself, deep inside wanting to just lash out and fight back against all this? Boy, I was going to use a profanity there, so I'll be careful not to. But, doesn't the politician in you just want to strike back hard?
Oh, yeah, and I've used profanity in this debate already, but I absolutely do. But Canadians are already doing that, right? I was in the grocery store the other day, and I saw a mother and a child, and she was showing the child the label to show where the product came from. Like that sort of thing is just fundamentally changed the way that we approach consumerism here. And so I think we're fighting back on an individual by individual basis here. What we've got to do, though, at this level is be smart. We got to be smarter than President Trump, right? He is putting these broad-based tariffs in that simply tax Americans, right, in an indiscriminate way, and Americans can't go anywhere but buy Canadian products. So they're basically just taxing Americans and raising revenue for the U.S. federal government. I think we can be much smarter than that. If we're going to do counter tariffs, let's do it on things where there are true alternatives. Let's not just set up a regime where we take municipal property tax dollars or dollars from the pockets of people in my city and put it in the federal government's coffers through retaliatory tariffs. Let's actually try to do something that makes sense and be smarter than what the U.S. administration is doing.
Jennifer, let me ask you about that as well. You're the chief administrative officer for the town. You're not elected, but you're dealing with elected officials every day. Do you find yourself having to talk them off the ledge from wanting to lash back hard against Trump?
I think we've had some really productive discussions, but like they're having in London, same sort of thing. We want to take a very intentional approach to this. We don't want to jump too quickly. We want to make sure that we set any policies or any procedures that we change. We want to make sure that those are things that we can enforce and they don't have any unintended consequences for us either. I think what it is it's getting a much smarter, more aware population. We're doing the same thing. When we go in the grocery store, we're looking at where we're purchasing, and now we're asking our staff to do the same thing. And it's that conscious awareness of where we're buying the goods and services we have at the municipality, same as the consumers. And it's really crossing over, and I think staff want to do that, and our politicians want us to do that, but we're not getting too crazy about it. We're trying to be very, very deliberate, very intentional, monitoring each step that we take and looking at what those consequences will be.
Well, Paul, humor me for a second. What if a chief administrative officer for some municipality in this province called you up and said, look, I can't stand what Trump is doing right now, and I want to hit back hard. Paul, make me a list of things I can do so that I can absolutely smack this guy right across the face. What would your advice be?
My advice would be to calm down. That would be the first thing I would recommend.
They don't want to hear that, Paul. They want to hear how you can help them smack him.
I'm not that kind of lawyer who tries to incite disputes. We have a lot of work to do, and we're trying to get contracts done to support public services. And so what we need to do is hit the brakes, as in this discussion, in a truly Canadian fashion. We're arriving at a well-reasoned consensus that we need to proceed with caution and be very deliberate and rational in our decision-making and how we respond to this crisis.
You know, Mayor Morgan, you may find yourself in a situation where in order to buy Canadian and prefer Canadian goods and or services, you might have to spend more than you have in the past if you can no longer source those goods or services in the United States. That's a conundrum for somebody who's trying to keep tax rates down. How do you handle that?
That's engaging with our provincial and federal counterparts, right? If we're going to, and let's step back for a second. Let's say our capital plan, our $200 million capital plan gets $25 million more expensive. If we pull back on that capital plan, we're basically pulling back on an economic injection into our community, the job creation, building the roads and the sewers and the community centers that we know we need at a time when we probably shouldn't be because the economy is under threat. So how do we absorb that? Property taxes is not the way to do that. But if the federal government is filling up coffers because they're taking in counter tariffs, there is money at play here that can be partnered with municipalities and say, let's maintain those economic injections. Let's talk about supporting that infrastructure plan together. And then let's proceed with what you've planned already without layering additional pressure on property taxes at the local level. Because remember, the counter tariffs will generate revenue for Ottawa. What to do with that revenue is a really important conversation, and how we can be strategic in supporting local economies, I think, is one of those discussions that I've already engaged with our friends at the federal level and provincial level about. And I think that's the way to approach this.
Well, let me follow up with you in this regard, because I take your point that all of you are trying to, keep calm and carry on while at the same time show some strength in the face of these unjust tariffs. So give me a sense, Mayor Morgan, as to how you think. Well, let's start with Doug Ford. Doug Ford is obviously trying to walk that balance of looking strong, looking tough, while at the same time not over-escalating. And we saw that he took the surcharges off the electricity to sort of buy a pause of calm at the moment. How well do you think he's doing right now?
I think Premier Ford's doing a great job. I had traveled to Washington with him a little while back. We met with American senators, congressmen, American business leaders. I met with a number of American mayors. And the interesting thing is his message is resonating, as is that of Canadian municipalities, particularly with our counterparts in the U.S. who do not see this as benefiting their communities or their consumers in any sort of way. And I think part of the solution to this isn't exactly how we respond to Donald Trump, but how Americans respond to Donald Trump, right? Because they are hurt by this in a significant way, and they do not see the sense in this. And so there is a partnership here. As much as we want to talk about buying Canadian, and I like supporting my city, and I like supporting Canadian products, there is still a really critical partnership with everyday average Americans, and then their leadership at the municipal, provincial, and state and federal level to say this doesn't make sense, and we're on the same team here about moving away from fighting each other and getting back to one of the most successful economic partnerships the world has seen, and that's where we want to get to. So it's kind of a tricky thing to navigate through because, as you said, You want to be out there waving the Canadian flag, but recognize that there are a lot of Americans who agree with us that these tariffs do not make any sense whatsoever.
Paul, can I get a comment from you on that as well? How well do you think both our national and provincial leaders are finding the balance between looking tough, talking strong, but not over-escalating?
I think that's a tenuous analysis, Steve, and it changes by the day and how quickly we respond and don't respond. But one of the areas that I take a silver lining out of this, as was mentioned previously, is that our provincial leaders need to focus on removing interprovincial trade barriers. That has been a major impediment to economic growth in Canada, and hopefully that focus is sustained and they maintain and follow through on those commitments.
Jennifer, is anything happening on that is constructive and positive enough to satisfy the folks in Northumberland County in terms of breaking down those barriers within the country as opposed to outside the country?
I don't think we're significantly impacted by those internal barriers. I think there's probably some hidden barriers that maybe we're not aware of, but it has not been a big issue for us. I think it's all going to help. And I think that's part of the education process as we look at our procurement processes maturing through this and becoming smarter and looking at ways that we can broaden where we're getting our goods from. So I think that's all part of the learning that we're doing, and changing those artificial barriers that we have within our country, I think will certainly open up avenues for us to get the goods and services that we need to deliver our services.
And a follow-up for you, Jennifer. The Premier of Ontario has mused about passing new legislation which would require municipalities to, buy Ontario or buy Canadian. What do you think about the advisability of doing that?
I think that's a really tough one, because there's so many essential services that we need, and we don't always have the luxury of opting not to purchase something. So there are a lot of services that are essential. The example earlier with paramedic services or long-term care services, we have to have the supplies to offer those. And there's some examples, when I look at our lower tiers, they're talking about chemicals for treating water treatment chemicals. We're looking at some of the heavy equipment that we buy. Some of those things just aren't available here. And we need to have some of that flexibility. So if there is going to be any requirements, we still need some flexibility in that legislation that we can not disrupt the services that our residents rely on, and that we can make sure that they have what they need. And that's really our bottom line, is delivering those services, but not artificially inflating the prices at the same time by forcing us to look at other avenues.
Well, let me go to Mayor Morgan on that. Have you discussed that with the Premier of Ontario? And if so, what advice have you given him, or would you give him on that front?
I've talked to the Premier several times, and I'm pretty consistent in my messaging, and that's we can and we should fight back. We should take action, but we can be much more strategic than Donald Trump is being on this. And so play it smart, right? Let's play it strategic. Let's talk to each other. Let's understand the consequences of our actions, and then let's move forward together. And I think that that's something the Premier is interested in pursuing. Sure, we can move towards buying even more local and more Ontarian and more Canadian, but let's make sure that that makes absolute sense, and that is the most strategic thing to do in this fight. Because again, if there is something that we absolutely have to buy from the U.S. anyways, and there is not yet a Canadian or international alternative, simply filling up federal coffers with counter-tariff money, and that's not really impacting that U.S. business at all. So being strategic, I think, is the smartest possible thing we can do here.
Paul, how about it? Do you think it's an advisable thing for the province of Ontario to pass a new law obliging municipalities to buy Canadian or buy Ontarian?
Frankly, no. The complications that would be incurred through the attempt to implement that policy would grind and logjam our procurement process almost instantaneously. If we're trying to conduct that analysis to see if every product is Canadian enough, we don't have the resources to be able to withstand that type of additional strain in the system. The government procurement system is a very delicate ecosystem, and we often take it for granted, but we rely on it for a broad range of goods and services that are critical to public service delivery.
Mayor Morgan, do I assume that you have relationships with fellow mayors south of the border?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I have great relationships with a number of mayors there. I chair the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Big City Mayors Caucus, which is the 23 largest cities in Canada, my counterpart in the U.S. at the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, and even the Association of Counties there. I've met with all of their leadership. I've spoken with them, and we have ongoing dialogue about this. The U.S. Conference of Mayors passed a resolution saying basically the tariffs don't make sense and we shouldn't be fighting our Canadian partners. They're our partners with us, and this is not good for any of us. We have great, strong allies at the municipal level in the U.S., and that's why, for all of the Canadian pride here, we also need to recognize that we have American leaders who will stand by us through this, who recognize the historic partnership and the strong allyship that we have between our two countries, and we're not going to let one person who happens to be the president throw all of that away. That being said, we need to prepare for the actions of that one individual. Will Americans work out the type of pressure that they're going to put from the bottom up on him?
Let me put you on the spot here. When you have those late night phone calls with a mayor from a similarly sized city in the United States, and you two start talking about the President of the United States, what is your counterpart in America? How do they refer to the current president?
Kind of depends if they're Republican or Democrat, but even the Republicans are very concerned about the tariffs. I will say there is a fear of repercussionary actions against their municipalities and their cities. They've seen the president be vindictive on political enemies, and so there is a relative fear of speaking up. And again, American cities, what always comes up is there are other executive orders that have greatly impacted the local level of government in the U.S. by restricting grants, freezing infrastructure funding, and they're working through those challenges as well, and that has created tremendous pressure on them. So it isn't great. I don't think the president has a really great impression at the local level because of a number of actions he's taken. We are focused on tariffs, but the Americans are focused on some of those other executive orders that have really impacted municipalities and their ability to provide those basic services in the U.S.
In our last few minutes here, Jennifer, is this the new normal? Is this what your life and the life of your council is going to be like for the next 4 or 8 years?
I think that we're used to being adaptable to whatever's going on in the broader community. So I think it's going to be a challenge. We are certainly still struggling with some of the repercussions after COVID, inflation, and getting budgets back in line. So this is going to be a real challenge for our communities. We've seen our levy tax rates this year be quite a bit higher than what we've seen in previous years. The impact of tariffs counter tariffs could certainly have a big dollar impact. If we're looking just at capital projects, some early analysis is a % or 2, and that's a lot for our residents to have to see on their property taxes if we can't have supports from other levels of government to try and keep those projects going forward. We have to be nimble. I think a lot of the municipalities are accustomed to that. Our budgets are tight, and we're used to responding, but it's going to be a tough slog over the next few years.
Paul, last 30 seconds to you. Are you advising your clients to buckle up and get used to this for the next 4 or 8 years?
We're not looking that far into the future, quite frankly, Steve. It's too hard to predict. So we're trying to deal with the here and now. We have operational impacts. I was just speaking with the school board yesterday. Their suppliers are adding an extra 25% to a new order of supplies. They don't have that extra 25%. We're trying to deal through and brace for impact on day-to-day transactions that are coming in. But I am optimistic in the long term that cooler heads will prevail. Our federal government will be able to rein this in and get to the bargaining table probably early on NAFTA 3.0. And in the meantime, we really need to de-escalate this and get back to business. There's plenty of important work that needs to be done for the Canadian public. We can't afford these types of distractions.
I want to thank the three of you for sharing your experiences with us and our viewers and listeners on TVO tonight. Josh Morgan, the Mayor of London, Jennifer Moore, the CAO from Northumberland County, Paul Emanuele from the Procurement Office. Great to have you all on our program tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For all his threats, U.S. President Donald Trump still has not imposed widespread tariffs on Canadian goods covered by the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade deal, with the exception of steel and aluminum, which were imposed this morning. In fact, he has delayed the start date of tariffs on Canada and Mexico twice. The economy is already being battered by uncertainty around tariffs. Will there be another delay? How long will tariffs last if and when they're imposed? Well, for a better understanding of all of this, we welcome Don Desjardins, who is Chief Economist for Deloitte Canada. Don, it's great to have you back in that chair.
Thank you.
I want to have you take us back to prior to November of last year. Mm-hmm. What was the outlook for the Canadian economy prior to the presidential election?
Well, you know what? It was quite bright. Our forecast was that the Canadian economy would grow 2% this year. That's pretty good. When we consider we've only about 1.5% for the prior couple. We were looking at inflation pressures that had eased substantially. We saw interest rates that were lower. Canadians were going to have to refi some of their mortgages, but that combination of steady employment gains, big increases in their savings, and lower rates were going to make it okay. We'd get through that difficult period of refinancing, and businesses were going to start to invest.
Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance and no, never mind, I won't go into the song. But we're going to show a chart here. This is a chart of Canadian business confidence. From February, it was published by the CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, keeping in mind that the vast majority of its members are small and medium-sized businesses. And for those listening on podcast, let me just take you through this chart. It looks like a bit of an EKG going up and down a bit. A big drop, of course, in consumer confidence and business confidence in 2020 when COVID hit, but then it came back very strong. And then came November of last year. What do we think happened in November of last year, Don, to make business confidence take a bit of a dip, as it clearly has in that chart?
Well, I think it was the case that the new administration was going to be doing a lot to increase the competitiveness of U.S. companies. They were going to be reducing corporate tax rates. They were going to be reducing regulation. And all of this would make the U.S. a much more competitive place. So perhaps some Canadian businesses looking at that environment thinking, might be a little more difficult to compete with these companies. But at the same time, a stronger U.S. economy, at least at that stage, would suggest that perhaps we were going to have more demand for our exports. Of course, November 24th changed all that.
What happened November 24th?
We were threatened with tariffs.
And tariffs is his favorite word in the English language, right? That's what he says. It's his favorite word.
Most beautiful, apparently.
The most beautiful word. That's the way he put it. How has the Canadian economy performed from the first week of November last year to date?
Well, we did see some actually strong data in the latter part of 2024. That was actually surprisingly strong. And what we did see was some activity on the export side. And this carried on into January because, of course, Canadian companies were looking at their buyers south of the border, and those buyers were saying, hey, maybe you could send us a little bit ahead of time so we don't have to pay the tariffs when we import your goods. And so we did see a bit of a flurry of activity in terms of that trade. We were seeing some buildup of inventories. The same here in Canada. We were importing more. Not to the extent we were exporting, but we were importing more, trying to build up inventories of tariff-free goods because we know that we're pretty integrated as economies.
And what was the exchange rate on the Canadian dollar vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar, historically speaking? Where were we at?
Well, we were more, I think, in the 1.38. We're now today at 1.44, so 69 cents-ish. So we have certainly lost ground since that time.
It's interesting, though, the tariffs, of course, had not hit by November 24th of last year, and yet people were making decisions, businesses were making decisions based on words, right? Just on what they anticipated was about to happen. That's all it takes?
Well, sometimes if someone says it often enough and is committed to it. And so certainly, as you said, we've had a couple of reprieves in terms of these blanket tariffs of 25%. But when we're thinking about businesses and consumers, Canadians, and we're sitting back going, okay, there's someone who's adamant about increasing the costs of our exports into their market, and they're bound and determined to make this happen. So we start to examine, of course, okay, what should I be doing at this particular point in time? So for businesses, 77% of our exports go south of the border. That's going to be a real reduction, you would think, in terms of demand for our goods going into the U.S. 25% essential tax on that. That's going to be pretty damaging. So I think what we've seen is Canadian businesses pause and take a look at, should I be investing to expand my production capacity? It seems like a lot of that has been put on hold, which is natural. And for Canadian consumers, they're saying, okay, so these businesses, not going to be as much demand potentially for their goods. And as a result, will they be looking to lay me off? So should I be spending right now? So today, the Bank of Canada made a decision on interest rates. And with that, they released some updated news on these survey type things like your CFIB survey. And what they showed was exactly that happened, that Canadian businesses, increasing number of them say, we might have to do some layoffs. We're not going to be investing as much as we otherwise would have. We'll keep the projects we have already in process, but not going to add too much. Canadian households going to continue to beef up those savings and probably not going to be spending on big ticket items right now. So it is, as you would expect, as you say, this is just the threat outside of steel and aluminum. But this is of grave concern because it will have a significant impact on our economy.
Well, everybody's asking about the impact of tariffs, but I want to ask a different question. The impact of just uncertainty, not tariffs, but uncertainty. Talk to us about that.
Well, I mean, I think it's we've seen it historically. In uncertain times, everybody kind of battens down the hatches. We're not sure how this is going to play out. We don't know how our costs of doing business, how that's going to play out. We don't know if there's going to be demand. If we make a big expansion, are we going to be able to sell it? Are we going to get a return on that investment? And so to that extent, I think that's what we see, a giant step back by both businesses and then also consumers who are wondering, they're stepping back on spending money. What does that mean in terms of their labor market? Do they want to keep as many employees? So as you say, and we've also seen volatility in financial markets. One day they're feeling like, oh, this might be okay. The next day they're feeling that, oh my goodness, this could cause a recession. Even in the U.S., the U.S. data is also showing a pretty pronounced slowing. And that's sort of interesting, right? Because everyone was anticipating another good year for the U.S. economy. It was going to be great because lower taxes were going to spur investment. We're going to see strong job growth. We're going to see, they thought at that point, lower interest rates. So it was a very good story for the U.S. But now, when some of the data is coming out, survey indicators showing some deterioration in sentiment, some concern about orders that they're going to be having to fill. And so as a result, it does suggest that the U.S. economy is also feeling the pinch from this talk of tariffs.
So when you take all those metrics together and you consider all of the millions of individual decisions that are going to be made by businesses, by consumers, by labor, etc., okay, lay that out for us. What does that look like in terms of how much the economy will contract, how many jobs we will lose, what it will do to inflation, etc.?
Well, for Canada, if in fact April 2nd we see some tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, which again, difficult to know exactly what that's going to look like, it would be likely, at least in our view, that we'll start to see the economy contract. Now, how deep that contraction is will depend on a few things. First of all, if they come, but secondly, are they the widespread tariffs, the blanket tariffs that have originally been suggested by the Trump administration? Are there going to be carve-outs for autos, for example, for energy? That will mitigate some of that hit to our economy. How long will they last? So we built into our forecast that we're still working on because we have a lot of things to keep changing every day. That suggests that we probably see a couple quarters of decline in GDP for Canada. And
well, that's a recession.
That is a recession. Now, the depth and duration of the recession, again, is contingent on all of this continuing to be in place. So if we get big tariffs that are spread out through the economy and last 6 months, that's probably a recession for Canada. And that will will lead to job losses. Now, the depth of those, again, questionable, but we could see significant job losses and an unemployment rate that moves up to 7.5%, say. So we're at 6.6. That's a pretty big increase. And we would see inflation pressures, we think, rise. Now, when we're looking at inflation, this is definitely the two-handed economist conversation. You have the tariff impact because we retaliate. We have the Canadian dollar, as we said, that is weaker, so that also increases costs of things we're importing. But if we're seeing a situation where the U.S. economy is slowing, the global economy is slowing, that does likely put downward pressure on commodity prices. And we have a lot of slack in our economy already. It was being eaten up as we had those stronger growth rates in the latter part of last year, but still slack that could mitigate some of the upward pressure on prices. So our reckoning says inflation could be anywhere from a couple tenths of a percent higher than the 2% target, as much as 1% higher. So definitely the case that the direction of inflation is up. The magnitude will depend on all of these variety of factors.
Was it President Harry Truman who said, I'm looking for a one-armed economist because I'm tired of hearing on the one hand, on the other hand? Something like that. Okay, let me get your opinion about this, because I have heard conflicting views on whether or not if we bring genuine free trade within Canada to the fore, and we break down a lot of these non-tariff barriers that exist between provinces, we can significantly mitigate the damage that the tariffs will have on our economy. I've heard some people say that yes, we can do that. I've heard other people say, not a chance. The effect of the tariffs will be significantly more. Where do you come down on that?
I think the tariffs will be more powerful. But having said that, it will, if we eliminate them. Deloitte did a paper on this in 2021. So we're going to revise and revisit this issue. But what it said was that at that point, interprovincial trade barriers acted like a 7% tariff between Canadians. Which, wow, that seems...
7%, that's 7%, yeah. That's a big number.
Yeah, it's not 25, but it's certainly something.
Yep.
And that if we eliminated them, they would increase our GDP by about 4%. So that is something that would mitigate. I don't think it would totally offset the impact. And the other thing about that, if we eliminated them, and let's say eliminated them for good, that will raise our potential output of our economy. So that could be a really important and sustained change. With the tariffs coming from south of the border, again, I don't know if it's our hope, but it's certainly our assumption that they won't last forever because the U.S. economy is going to feel pain.
Don, I've had people ask me about this, so maybe you could give an example of what we mean here when we say we have free trade agreements with other countries, but we don't have it within Canada. Can you give an example of a kind of a typical interprovincial trade barrier that inhibits our economic productivity and as a result affects our growth?
Well, the biggest one, I think, for me anyway, when I think about it, is labor mobility. You know, the fact that you can be an engineer in one province but not automatically move provinces and be an engineer. This is a productivity loss. I mean,
you got to recertify every time you change provinces.
Exactly. So to me, that is a big one. We also know things are the high profile being, you can't bring alcohol from one province to the other. Right. That's a fairly high profile, as we've seen in terms of a case that happened between New Brunswick and Quebec. But these are the types of things. It's also, there's really, okay, this sounds bizarre, but first aid kits. What's in a first aid kit? What's in, truckers? What are their different rules for their different tire sizes? These things are just impediments to freely moving goods across our country. So there are many which seem niche, but nonetheless, are they really necessary?
We have heard that this is a almost unique opportunity in Canadian history to do something about this. As you watch the premiers and their negotiators, their representatives deal with this issue, are you seeing us make some progress right now?
I think we are. I mean, certainly everything I read suggests, we're coming together, thinking about this like, well, why would we do that? Why are we hampering this trade? So I do feel that it's a bizarre silver lining to all of this, that we're having this external negative factor really catalyze the Canadian policymakers, the Canadians, to say, okay, let's look at our own house. What should we be doing to ensure that we have a more productive economy, that goods and services can flow more easily across our country? And what should we be doing looking at other trade agreements that we have? And none of these things, in my view, are easy or quick. But if we can really actually lean into them, maybe it does not mitigate enough that prevents us from going in recession. Okay, that's to me a sensible way to approach it. But over the medium term, does it mean that we have a stronger growth momentum as we get into 2026, 27? But I think we're building those blocks to having a stronger economy.
Let me do a follow-up on the recession issue. If the United States, and a recession, if I remember, 2 negative quarters of growth consecutively, if the United States goes into a technical recession where they have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, is it a given that we will too?
Well, if it's all because of the tariffs, I think we will. We wouldn't necessarily, we are in a different spot, I think, than the U.S. in terms of the cycle. We have inflation that at this moment is under control. We have interest rates that have come down significantly. Yes, we have a highly indebted household sector, but we are able to go through this period. Now, if the U.S. economy stumbled for reasons that aren't necessarily to do with tariffs, could be some other, they've just hit their speed limit and now they're going to start to lose momentum, I don't know that we necessarily follow into recession. Usually the cycles are synced. We're a little bit ahead this time and our rates are significantly lower than the U.S. So I think that might give us a little insulation, and that weak Canadian dollar, it does make Canadian exports into the U.S. cheaper.
As you folks watch the White House trying to figure out what kind of policy and what statements are emerging so that you can do your jobs and give advice to your clients, we saw on one day Donald Trump, in the joint address to Congress, say, we're going to have a little adjustment, right? Like a minor adjustment in the economy. And then he was asked on Air Force One, are we going to go into a recession? And he hesitated and said, might be a brief one. And then yesterday he said, oh no, it's going to be all guns blazing. It's going to be fantastic. We're going to have the best economy in the history of the universe. Which of those 3 statements are we supposed to take at face value?
That is an excellent question, one I do not know the answer to. I do think that if this all goes according to the direction it looks like it's going to, we probably will see slower U.S. economic activity. We've already seen U.S. consumers, in terms of their confidence has come down significantly. We have seen stock market correction recently. Now it's wobbling along, but nonetheless, it has had some pretty horrifying days recently as investors take a look to see whether or not does this spell recession, and what does that mean for all the companies I've invested in? We've seen earnings calls where some of these companies are saying, you know what, we're a little bit worried here about how we're going to be able to make our earnings targets and moving them down. So all of that to say, you're starting to see this shaking at the foundation, I would say, for the U.S. economy. Now, we know the administration wants to get their corporate income taxes down. Can they do that? I don't think they're going to get the money from this tariff regime to offset the impact on their budget balance. So maybe they're not going to get to 15%. And if that's the case, what does that mean for companies when they're thinking about investment and thinking about the returns on those investments? So I don't know that, adjustment is, I'm not really sure what that refers to. But I do think that you will have substantially slower growth than you otherwise would have had in this environment of uncertainty.
Okay, in our last few minutes here, let's talk about, because we're about to get a new prime minister in this country, and he is no doubt considering his options for backstopping the economy and the problems that we're having and are about to have as a result of all of the craziness coming out of the United States right now. What are his options? What can Mark Carney do?
Well, I think he can push forward with working with the provinces to alleviate these interprovincial trade barriers. We know that the government has announced that they are going to be giving the Export Development Bank $5 billion in order to increase Canadian companies' ability to export to other countries.
Is that real money? $5 billion, is that considered real money?
Well, it certainly is.
I mean,
I think it's sufficient enough to get some companies, smaller companies in particular, in the market.
$2 trillion economy, so $5 billion is a bit of a drop in the bucket. But
having, we have also incentive from our trading partner letting us, the unreliable trading partner.
Yeah.
And I think as well, just getting this, it could build over time, but certainly, step in the right direction and a nod, I think, to Canadian businesses that, hey, we have 15 free trade agreements, 1.6 billion customers in the world, conceivably. How can we move towards those markets? And as I said earlier, 77% of our exports going to the States suggests that we haven't moved a lot in that direction so far. So we also have some support for the consumer segment with the work sharing EI. So, all of these things are there, I think, to signal to Canadians, whether they're workers or they're businesses, that there are other avenues that we can tap and that there will be some supports in place to get us through this hump. Now, if tariffs just keep ratcheting up, I don't know that those are, as you say, it might be just a spit in the bucket. But assuming that we aren't going to go through a period of ratcheting up tariffs, which is a grand assumption, I will say, at this stage, I think those are the types of moves that we're going to see support from the governments as we go forward.
You ever seen stupider policy in your life come out of the United States?
It's a little surprising, I have to
Surprising.
say.
Okay, you're just going to go with surprising. Okay, I understand. That's the diplomat, Don Desjardins from Deloitte, Canada, joining us tonight here on TVO. Don, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, March 12th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, how are border towns experiencing this tariff war with the U.S.? We'll look into that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.